is a moment when you realize the betrayal has already happened. You just weren't warned. For me, that moment came in a notary's office on Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the last Tuesday of October. It was raining outside. I remember that because I was watching the drops run down the glass and thinking, how strange that everything outside looks so ordinary when inside they have just said aloud the thing that was supposed to destroy me. The notary was reading my grandmother Dorothy Wells's will. 81 years, 7 months, and 14 days. That was how long she'd lived. A retired elementary school teacher. A woman who sewed curtains from old bed sheets, never bought coffee at a cafe because it's better and cheaper at home, and tucked money into envelopes labeled by hand in pencil. For taxes, for winter, for Sarah. She had shown me that last envelope 4 years ago. I was sitting at her kitchen table drinking tea from a cup painted with forget-me-nots, and she opened the dresser drawer, took out a folder, and said, "Look, this is yours. I've taken care of it." $83,000. I saw my name in the document with my own eyes. Sarah Elizabeth Chambers. Clear. Unambiguous. And now, the notary was saying a different name. Nicole Chambers. My brother Kyle's wife. Married to him for 9 months. 9 months. That is less than a pregnancy. Less than a school year. It is, apparently, enough to receive $83,000 that have nothing to do with you. I didn't scream. I didn't even turn to look at my parents right away. I just stared at the notary and waited for him to stop and say, "I'm sorry, I turned the wrong page." He didn't stop. He kept reading in the steady voice of a man who is paid to read such things in a steady voice. Then I turned around. My father was staring at the table. Not at the floor, at the table, with the expression of a man carefully studying a wooden surface. My mother was adjusting her gloves, slowly, deliberately, as though it were the most important task in the room. Kyle was sitting next to Nicole, holding her hand. Nicole was looking directly at the notary with an expression of polite gravity. Not one of them was surprised. Not a single person in that office was surprised. That was the blow. Not the will. Not Nicole's name. The silence that explained everything without a single word. But here is what none of them knew. What not one person in that room knew. There was a phone in the pocket of my coat, and 40 minutes later, a message would appear on it. A letter from a lawyer I had never met. And that letter would change everything. Before I tell you what was written in it, if this story resonates with something you have been through yourself, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And stay with me, because this is only the beginning. Let me explain how a family works when one child is an investment and the other is a line item in the expense column. It doesn't happen in a single day. It builds over years, brick by brick, and by the time you understand it, the wall has already been built and you are standing on the wrong side of it. My brother's name is Kyle Chambers. He is 4 years older than me. From the very beginning, in our family in Austin, there existed an unspoken rule that no one ever stated out loud, but that shaped absolutely everything. Kyle was the family's future. Kyle was the continuation of our father's name. Kyle was the one everything was for. Our father, Robert Chambers, spent his entire working life in construction. Not a major developer, just a man who knew how to lay a foundation and had built enough from that knowledge to buy a house in a decent neighborhood and send his children to a decent school. He loved Kyle the way men of his generation love sons. Loudly, practically, through actions. He came to every baseball game. He taught Kyle to drive at 15 in an empty shopping center parking lot. He talked to him about investments before Kyle was even 17. When Kyle was accepted to the University of Texas, Dad paid for the first 2 years without discussion. He simply wrote a check. When I was accepted to the same university 3 years later, Dad said, "Sarah, you need to look for a scholarship. Things are tight right now." There was nothing tight. I knew it. Mom knew it. Everyone knew it. When Kyle was 24, Dad gave him $40,000 to start a small construction company. I found out by accident. Mom let it slip at dinner, apparently forgetting I was also sitting at the table. When I asked directly why I had never been offered anything similar, Dad answered without malice, simply as an obvious fact. "You're a girl, Sarah. You'll get married. You'll have a husband who takes care of everything." I was 22 years old. I was standing at the sink washing dishes. I didn't say anything back, because I understood that any answer would be wasted. And in this family, there was one woman who saw things differently. Grandma Dorothy, my mother's mother, small and slight, with hands that were always a little rough from garden soil. She had lived alone in her house in the Sante Lake neighborhood since Grandpa died 12 years earlier. She didn't insert herself into family affairs publicly, didn't make scenes, didn't give lectures. But she saw. Once, when I was about 16, she took my hand right at the family dinner table. Everyone was there, Dad, Mom, Kyle, and said, loudly enough for all of them to hear, "Sarah is the smartest person I know, and she is going to go far. On her own." Dad looked at his plate. Mom changed the subject. Kyle asked someone to pass the bread, but I remembered. 4 years ago, when Grandma was 77, she called and asked me to come over. She said, "Come Sunday, alone. I want to show you something." I came. She took a folder from the dresser, opened it on the kitchen table under the lamp with the green shade, and said calmly, in the way people speak about something long decided, "This is my will. I had it drawn up 3 years ago with Attorney Coleman on 6th Street. Everything is written correctly. $83,000. This is yours, Sarah. I saved it my whole life, and I know who needs it." I saw the document. I saw my name. I saw my grandmother's signature and the notary's seal. I did not think I would ever need to prove that it had been real. There are people who know how to enter someone else's life in a way that you don't notice when the door closes behind them. Nicole Davis, now Nicole Chambers, was exactly that kind of person. Kyle met her at his construction company's holiday party in January. By March, she was having lunch with our parents. By May, she was calling my mother Mrs. Chambers, with an inflection that made the address simultaneously respectful and warm. A rare skill. In June, she asked whether she might stop by sometime to visit Grandma Dorothy. "Kyle has talked about her so much. I'd love to meet her." Mom was touched. Dad said, "You see, Sarah? That's how it's done." I didn't answer. Nicole began visiting Grandma once a week, then twice. She drove her to doctor's appointments, since Grandma didn't have a car and didn't like cabs. She brought groceries. She sat with her, looked through old photographs, listened to stories about Grandpa. When I called Grandma and asked how she was doing, she began mentioning Nicole every other sentence. "Nicole came by last week and we baked a pie. Nicole found me a new doctor. Nicole is such a thoughtful girl." I visited Grandma less often, that's true. I had work. I was doing accounting for 2 small companies in Austin, renting an apartment 20 minutes away, and my weekends didn't always line up with convenient visiting hours. I called, I brought groceries once a month.
I didn't disappear from her life, but I wasn't there every week, and Nicole noticed. About 6 months before Grandma died, I came over on a Sunday and saw some papers on her table. A few pages, already folded, with a pen beside them. I asked what they were. Grandma said vaguely, "Nicole brought someone, some notary. There was something to sign, I don't quite remember." I asked, "Which notary, Grandma?" She shrugged. "Some friend of Nicole's. Everything is above board," she said. I felt a coldness I can't describe more precisely than simply coldness. Something is wrong. Something has already happened, and I won't find out about it right now. That same evening, I called Mom. I said, "Mom, some notary is coming to Grandma's with Nicole. She's signing things. We need to find out what exactly." Mom paused for a moment and then said, "Sarah, Nicole spends more time with Grandma than you do. She's helping. You don't need to be suspicious of people all the time." "I'm not being suspicious," I said. "I'm asking us to check the documents." "You're just jealous that Nicole isn't too lazy to show up," Mom said. And the conversation ended. 3 months later, Grandma was hospitalized with pneumonia. On the day she was lying in a hospital bed with an IV drip, barely able to focus her eyes, Nicole was there, alone, without anyone else from the family. The nurse in that room would later say something important, but that would come later, in court. Dorothy Wells died on a Sunday morning, quietly, in her sleep, in her house by the lake. She was 81. I found out at 7:30 in the morning when Mom called. I set down the phone, sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, and thought about the forget-me-nots on the teacup, the folder in the dresser, her hands always a little rough from garden soil. I didn't yet know that the folder in the dresser was no longer the same one. At the funeral, Nicole cried beautifully. That is a cruel observation, I know. But I was there, and I saw it. The tears appeared precisely when people were looking at her, and stopped precisely when their eyes moved away. A black dress, appropriate for the occasion, but well made enough to be noticed. She held Kyle's hand at the casket, and Mom looked at this with an expression of quiet gratitude, as though Nicole were the one keeping the whole family from falling apart in that moment. I stood at the other end of the casket and thought about the papers on the table. 4 days after the funeral, we gathered at the notary's office. Henley and Associates, 4th floor of a red brick building on Congress Avenue. The rain had started an hour earlier and showed no sign of stopping. There were 5 of us: me, Mom, Dad, Kyle, and Nicole. The notary, a man of about 55 with tired eyes and expensive watch, laid out the documents, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. When he said Nicole Chambers' name in the context of the primary inheritance, I waited for a pause. I waited for him to look up and say something like, "I beg your pardon, let me clarify." Instead, he turned the page and continued in the same tone he had used for the previous paragraph. $83,000. The house at Sante Lake. Personal belongings per a separate list. All of it. Nicole. Me? Nothing. Not a line. My name was not said once. I looked at my father. He was staring at the table. I looked at my mother. She was adjusting her gloves, slowly, a centimeter at a time, as though it were a task that required her complete concentration. Kyle was holding Nicole's hand. Nicole was watching the notary. Not one of them turned toward me. We filed out into the corridor, and I waited until the notary's door had closed. Then I stood in front of my mother and asked, evenly, without raising my voice, because I was already too tired for conversations where people raise their voices. "Did you know about this?" Mom looked at me with the expression of someone who had already chosen their answer in advance. "Grandma made this decision herself, Sarah. She changed her mind. She had that right." "When?" I asked. "Shortly before the hospital." "On the day Nicole was there alone?" Mom tightened her grip on her purse strap. "Nicole was there when you were busy with your own life. There's no need to make her the villain now." I looked at her, at the woman who had known and hadn't called me, hadn't said, "Sarah, something is happening, come," hadn't raised the question, had simply waited to see how it ended. It was at exactly that moment that the phone in my pocket vibrated. I didn't want to look at it, but something made me take it out. On the screen was a message from James Coleman, attorney at law. Subject line, "Regarding the estate of Dorothy Wells. Urgent." I was standing in the corridor of a notary's office on the 4th floor, surrounded by my family, who had just allowed my inheritance to pass in silence, and I was reading the first sentence of the letter. "Your grandmother asked me to contact you in the event that you learn of a change to her will. She did this intentionally. She knew this might happen." I walked to the stairwell, down, outside, into the rain. I read the letter in the parking lot, in the rain, leaning against someone else's car, not knowing and not caring whose it was. James Coleman, estate attorney, office on 6th Street in Austin. The same office where, 4 years ago, my grandmother had signed her original will, the one I had seen with my own eyes. This is what he wrote. 6 weeks before Dorothy Wells's death, on the 3rd Friday of August, she called him herself. Not through his secretary, directly, on the personal number she had kept since drafting the will. She called at 4 in the afternoon and said she wanted to meet in person, without family, without Nicole, just the two of them. Coleman saw her the following day. Dorothy arrived by cab. She called it herself, paid for it herself. She came into his office, sat down across from his desk, and said without preamble, "I was made to sign a new will. I didn't fully understand what I was signing, and I'm afraid it can't be undone." She told him that several weeks earlier, Nicole had come to her house with a notary, an unfamiliar man she had never seen before. Nicole had explained that this was a minor adjustment to some documents relating to the house, something about taxes, updating addresses, nothing important. Grandma had signed. She couldn't afterward remember exactly what had been on those pages. Her mind had been foggy during that period. Her doctor had said it was normal for her age and her condition. Coleman asked whether she had a copy of what she had signed. She said no. Nicole had taken all the copies. Then Coleman asked the most important question. What did she want from him? Dorothy said, "I want you to keep a copy of my real will, the one I signed with you 4 years ago. And I want you to have Sarah's contact information. If something happens to me and she goes to a notary and finds out the will has been changed, she needs to know that this was not my free decision. This was not my decision." She said it twice. Coleman wrote it down word for word. The envelope he had attached to the email contained 3 documents. The first, a copy of Dorothy Wells's original will, dated 4 years earlier, with my name, her signature, and the notary's seal. The second, a medical report from Dorothy's primary care physician, dated 8 months before her death. Early-stage cognitive impairment, reduced critical thinking, heightened susceptibility to pressure. The third, a brief written statement by Dorothy herself, composed in Coleman's office that Friday afternoon, signed in her own hand, in which she stated directly, the signing of the new will had occurred without her full understanding of the document's contents and under the influence of Nicole Chambers. I stood on the wet asphalt and read the letter 3 times, not because I hadn't understood it the first time, but because I needed to be certain it was real. My grandmother had known. She had anticipated that this might happen, and 6 weeks before her death, while she still had clarity, she had done everything she could. She had taken a cab to her lawyer's office, without anyone's help. She had left me evidence. I raised my face to the sky. The rain was cold and straight, like facts. Then, I put the phone in my pocket, went back inside, climbed to the 4th floor, and stood in the doorway of the notary's office, where my parents and Kyle and Nicole were still talking in low voices. They looked at me. I said only one thing. I'm contesting the will. You'll need a lawyer, Nicole, or you can find a new one. The room went quiet. Kyle was the first to look away. If you have ever stood like that, alone in front of a room full of people who were supposed to be on your side, write about it in the comments. I read every single one. And stay, because it gets more interesting from here. James Coleman's office was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building on 6th Street, sandwiched between a coffee roaster and an insurance agency. The elevator was out of service. I took the stairs. His assistant had scheduled me for 9 o'clock the following morning. I had barely slept. I'd spent most of the night at my kitchen table with the 3 documents printed out in front of me, reading them in different orders, as though the sequence might change what they said. It didn't. They said the same thing every time. Coleman was a man in his mid-60s, compact and deliberate, with the kind of unhurried precision that comes from decades of dealing with families at their worst. He shook my hand, gestured to the chair across from his desk, and said, "I'm sorry it took this long for us to speak in person. Your grandmother was very clear about when I should reach out." I asked him to walk me through everything from the beginning. He did. Dorothy had been his client for 11 years. She had first come to him when she was updating her estate documents after my grandfather's death, and she had returned twice since then. Once to update the property deed, and once, 4 years ago, to draft the will I had seen at her kitchen table. He described her in those meetings as sharp, deliberate, and completely clear about her intentions. She knew exactly what she had and exactly who she wanted to have it, he said. There was no ambiguity. The call she made 6 weeks before her death had concerned him immediately. Not because she sounded confused. She didn't, not that day. But because of what she described. According to Dorothy, Nicole had begun accompanying her to certain appointments over the preceding months. Medical appointments, errands, the occasional lunch. Grandma had welcomed it at first. She had told Coleman that Nicole was attentive and kind, and that it was pleasant to have company. But somewhere in the late summer, the nature of the visits had shifted. Nicole began bringing paperwork. Small things at first. A change of address form for a magazine subscription, an updated beneficiary designation for a modest savings account. Each document was presented as routine, minor, requiring only a signature. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in September, Nicole arrived with a man Dorothy had never seen before. Nicole introduced him as a notary, a colleague, she said, someone who helped with estate paperwork. He was friendly and efficient. He laid out a document on Dorothy's kitchen table and explained it in broad, reassuring strokes. It was an update to her estate plan, reflecting the new family members who had joined since the original will was drafted. Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about. Dorothy signed. The man collected all copies of the document. He and Nicole left within 30 minutes. It was only in the days that followed, as the fog in her memory began to lift and the clarity returned in patches, that Dorothy understood she had signed something she did not fully comprehend. She couldn't reconstruct the specific language. She couldn't remember the exact figures. But she remembered signing. And she remembered that Nicole had been the one to bring the papers and the one to take them away. Coleman pulled a separate folder from his desk drawer and set it in front of me. Inside was a photograph, a still image captured from the security camera in the lobby of the building where the second will had been filed for probate. A man, mid-40s, carrying a briefcase. Not a licensed notary. Coleman had checked. The man's notary certification had expired 14 months prior to the date on Dorothy's new will. An invalid notarization on a document signed by a person with documented cognitive impairment under circumstances that met the legal definition of undue influence in the state of Texas. "Is this enough?" I asked. Coleman set his hands flat on the desk. "In my professional opinion, yes. The question is whether you want to pursue it." I looked at the photograph of the man with the briefcase. I thought about my grandmother arriving at this office, alone, on a cab she called herself, saying, "This was not my decision." "What do I need to do?" I said. He told me. I called my mother that evening, not to ask permission, not to soften what was coming. I called because I believed, and I want to be honest about this because it matters. I still believed at that point that when she heard what Coleman had told me, something would shift. That she would understand. That she would say, "Sarah, we didn't know the full picture. We didn't know about the expired notary. We didn't know what Nicole had actually done." Mom picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. The security camera photograph, the expired notary certification, the medical documentation of Grandma's cognitive state, the statement Dorothy had left in Coleman's office. I spoke clearly and without raising my voice, the way Coleman himself had spoken to me, and I waited when I was finished. There was a long silence on the other end. Then my mother said, "Sarah, your grandmother loved Nicole. She made her decision." I sat with that for a moment. "Mom," I said, "the man who notarized the document wasn't licensed. His certification had been expired for over a year. I don't know anything about that. I know you don't. That's why I'm telling you." Another silence. Then, quieter. "What are you going to do?" "I'm filing a contest. Coleman is handling it." What followed was not a conversation. It was a sequence of statements, delivered in the flat, tired voice of a woman who had already decided which side of this she was on, and was not going to move. Grandma made her own choices. Nicole was good to her. You're going to tear this family apart over money. Is that really who you are? I didn't answer that last one. I said goodnight and hung up. My father called 20 minutes later. He didn't ask how I was. He said, "I hope you understand what you're doing to this family." His voice was not angry. It was something closer to disappointed, which was somehow harder to sit with. He had always used disappointment the way other fathers use volume. I said, "Dad, the notary wasn't licensed. The document is potentially invalid. That's not something I invented." He said, "Nicole has been good to all of us," as though that were a counter-argument, as though goodness in one area were a voucher that could be redeemed in another. I said goodnight to him too. Kyle called at 11 that night. I almost didn't pick up. But something in the fact that he was calling at 11, not 8, not 9, but 11, after the other two had already spoken to me, made me answer. His voice was different from both of theirs. Not flat, not disappointed. Quiet in a way I had not heard from him before. Like someone choosing words carefully in the dark. He said, "Sarah, please don't do this." Not, "You're wrong." Not, "Nicole didn't do anything." Just, "Please don't do this." I said, "Did you know, Kyle?" A pause long enough to be its own answer. Then, "I didn't know about the notary. I didn't know about any of that." Another pause. I thought Grandma had changed her mind. Nicole said Grandma wanted to do something for us. I thought it was real. I thought about that. About the difference between being complicit and being deceived. About whether that distinction mattered right now and how much. "I'm sorry," he said. And he did sound sorry. Not sorry in the way people sound sorry when they want you to stop doing something inconvenient. Sorry the way people sound when they are beginning to understand something they would have preferred not to understand. I didn't tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I said, "I hear you, Kyle." And I meant it. The same way I had meant it every other time I had said those words in the past year. Then I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the city outside, thinking about my grandmother on a cab to 6th Street, doing the only thing left in her power to do. The pretrial process took 11 weeks. I want to be honest about what those 11 weeks were like, because I think people who haven't been through civil litigation have a picture of it that looks like a courtroom drama. Sharp exchanges, decisive moments, a single confrontation where the truth comes out and everyone falls silent. The reality is quieter and slower and considerably more exhausting than that. It is documents. It is depositions. It is your attorney sending you emails at 6:30 in the morning with subject lines like, "Additional records request, please confirm." And you sitting at your desk before work, reading through medical timelines and notary registry databases, and trying to hold the shape of what actually happened while the official version of events is disputed paragraph by paragraph. My parents did not speak to me for the first 6 weeks. Kyle texted once, a short message that said only, "I hope this ends okay for everyone." I didn't respond. I didn't know what okay meant in that context, and I wasn't going to pretend I did. Nicole hired an attorney from a firm in downtown Austin. His name was Garrett Pruitt, and he was good, methodical and experienced, the kind of attorney who files motions the way other people breathe, reflexively and without particular emotion. He argued that Dorothy's signature was valid, that the cognitive assessment had been conducted months before the signing, and therefore could not speak to her capacity on the day in question, and that the relationship between Nicole and Dorothy had been one of genuine care and mutual affection. All of that was true, as far as it went. Dorothy had liked Nicole, at least initially. The cognitive report was from 8 months prior. None of that was invented. What Pruitt did not address, because he could not address it, was the notary. The man in the lobby photograph was identified through Coleman's investigation as a former paralegal who had allowed his notary certification to lapse and had not renewed it. He had no connection to any licensed notary firm. His presence at Dorothy's kitchen table on that Tuesday afternoon was not routine estate administration. It was a document signing conducted outside the bounds of legal certification, which, in the state of Texas, rendered the notarization invalid. Then, in the 8th week of the process, Coleman's investigator found something else. 3 years earlier, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a 74-year-old woman named Helen Marsh had died leaving an estate that had been redirected, through a last-minute will revision, away from her daughter and toward a younger woman who had befriended her in the final year of her life. The case had been contested. The contest had ultimately been dropped due to insufficient evidence. The younger woman had collected the inheritance and moved on. Her name, at the time, had been Nicole Davis. Coleman placed the Louisiana case documents in front of the judge during the pretrial hearing alongside the Texas evidence. He did not argue that Nicole was a habitual predator. He didn't need to. He argued that a pattern of behavior existed, that the circumstances were materially similar, and that, taken together with the invalid notarization and the medical documentation, the burden of proof for undue influence had been met. Nicole's attorney objected. The judge reviewed the materials and said she would consider their admissibility. My parents were seated 3 rows behind Nicole and her attorney. When the Louisiana documents were presented and Coleman read the name Helen Marsh into the record, I turned around for just a moment. Not to see Nicole's face, to see my mother's. She was sitting very still, with her hands folded in her lap. Not crying, not speaking, just sitting, with an expression I had not seen on her face before. The particular stillness of someone who has just been handed information that does not fit inside the story they have been telling themselves. My father was sitting beside her. He did not move, but I saw him close his eyes for just a second, and I understood. He hadn't known about Louisiana. Nicole had kept that from him. She'd kept it from all of them. What he had believed, what they had both believed, was a simpler story. A daughter-in-law who was attentive, an old woman who changed her mind, a family arrangement that had been handled privately and would simply become the new reality once the paperwork was finalized. That was the story they had agreed to accept. Louisiana made that story impossible. The judge's decision came on a Thursday morning, 43 days after the pretrial hearing. I was at work when Coleman called. I stepped out of the office into the stairwell, the same way I had taken the stairs up to his office 11 weeks earlier, and stood on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floor with my hand against the concrete wall and listened. The judge had ruled the second will invalid on 2 independent grounds. First, the notarization was performed by an individual whose certification had lapsed and had not been renewed, rendering it legally deficient under Texas Estates Code. Second, the totality of circumstances, including the medical documentation, the absence of independent legal counsel for Dorothy at the time of signing, the removal of all document copies by the party who stood to benefit, and the corroborating pattern of similar conduct in another jurisdiction, met the threshold for undue influence under Texas law. The original will, drafted in Coleman's office 4 years ago and preserved in his files at Dorothy's explicit request, was reinstated as the governing document. $83,000. The house at Sante Lake. The personal belongings. Mine. I stayed in that stairwell for a while after Coleman hung up. Not celebrating. That is not quite the right word for what I felt. It was more like the particular stillness that comes after a very long effort has ended. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but full, in the way that a room is full after everyone has finally said what needed to be said. I thought about my grandmother calling a cab, sitting in Coleman's office, saying, "This was not my decision," twice so he would be sure to write it down. She had done what she could with what she had.
She had been 81 years old, and her memory was beginning to cloud, and someone she had trusted had brought a man with an expired certificate to her kitchen table. And even so, even with all of that, she had found a way to tell the truth before it was too late. I owed her the rest. I had simply finished what she started. Kyle and Nicole divorced 8 weeks after the ruling. I didn't find out from Kyle. I found out from my mother, who mentioned it in passing during a phone call about something else entirely, as though it were incidental information, a footnote. Nicole had moved out. The process had been quick and uncomplicated, which suggested to me that the marriage had not accumulated much that needed untangling. Kyle called me 3 weeks after that. It was a Sunday evening, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But I had made a decision, somewhere in those 11 weeks, about what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of all of this. Not generous in a way that costs nothing. Genuinely available to the possibility that things between us could be something other than what they had been. So I answered. He didn't congratulate me on the ruling. He didn't apologize for Nicole, or for his role in accepting what she had told him without questioning it more carefully. He said, "I didn't know about the woman in Louisiana. I want you to know that. If I had known, I would have." He stopped. Then, "I should have asked more questions. I know that now." I let that sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "I know you didn't know, Kyle." A pause. "It would have helped, though, if you had asked." "I know," he said. "I know it would have." We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important. His company, my work, the weather in Austin, which had finally broken into something resembling fall. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a resolved chapter. It was two people who share a history finding out, cautiously, whether there is still something navigable between them. I didn't know the answer yet, but I was willing to find out. 6 months later. This is where I am. The house at Sante Lake sold in early spring. I didn't keep it. It was too large for me alone, and the upkeep would have eaten the value inside of 3 years. And, more honestly, I wasn't sure I was ready to spend weekends in the rooms where Grandma Dorothy had lived out the last years of her life, while someone was quietly rearranging her paperwork in the next room. Some spaces hold too much to be practical. The proceeds, combined with the liquid assets, came to just over $91,000 after legal fees and estate costs. I didn't spend it right away. I put it in a separate account and left it there for 2 months while I thought about what Dorothy would have wanted it to do. Not what I wanted. What she would have wanted. She had been a teacher for 31 years. She had believed, with the specific conviction of someone who has watched children become people, that education was the thing that could not be taken from you once you had it. She used to say, "Money goes, knowledge stays." It was the kind of saying that sounds like a greeting card until you've watched someone try to take your money and realize she was right. I enrolled in an evening accounting certification program at the University of Texas. I had been doing bookkeeping for years on the strength of experience and self-teaching, and I had always meant to formalize it, and I had always found a reason to wait. I stopped waiting. I also set aside a portion for a small emergency fund, the kind Dorothy herself had always kept, in those hand-labeled envelopes, for taxes and for winter and for the things that arrive without warning. I understood now, in a way I hadn't before, that those envelopes had not been about scarcity. They had been about readiness, about being the kind of person who is not caught off guard when the ground shifts. My parents and I speak now, carefully,
in the way of people who have walked through something difficult together and are still determining what the relationship looks like on the other side. My father called first, 3 months after the ruling. He didn't apologize for everything. I did not expect him to, and I would not have believed a comprehensive apology delivered all at once. What he said was, "You were right about the notary. We should have listened when you first raised it." 3 sentences. But they were true ones, and he said them without being asked. My mother took longer. She called in the 4th month, on a Sunday, and we talked for almost an hour. She talked about Dorothy, not about the case, not about Nicole, just about her mother. The woman who had sewn curtains from bed sheets and kept money in labeled envelopes and taken a cab alone to a lawyer's office at 81 years old to make sure her granddaughter would know the truth. I think that was my mother's way of saying what she wasn't ready to say directly. I accepted it. Nicole, to my knowledge, has left Austin. Coleman's contacts in the Louisiana legal community indicated that the Baton Rouge case had been reopened for review in light of the Texas ruling. I don't know what will come of it. That is not my case to pursue. I handed over the relevant documents when asked, and let the people whose job it is do their job. I want to say something to you before I close, because I believe you came here for a reason. Maybe someone in your family made a decision that affected you without including you. Maybe something that was promised to you, not in a legal document, not in writing, but in the specific way that people who love each other make promises, quietly, at kitchen tables, under lamps with green shades, was taken from you. Maybe you were told to let it go, that family is more important than money, that making a fuss is the same as being greedy, that the person who asks for what belongs to them is somehow the one causing the problem. Here is what I know. My grandmother did not leave me money because she wanted to cause conflict. She left it to me because she had watched, for decades, the way things worked in our family. Who got the check, and who was told to find a scholarship. Who got the startup capital, and who was told to get married and let someone else worry about it. And she wanted, with the years and the resources she had left, to do something about it. That was her right. It was a considered, deliberate, documented decision made by a woman in full possession of her intentions. Protecting that decision was not greed. It was honoring her. If someone has taken something from you, something promised, something earned, something that was yours, and the people around you are calling you difficult for saying so, I want you to hear this clearly. Asking for what belongs to you is not the same as causing harm. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a person who is gone is to tell the truth about what they actually wanted. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I was standing in a parking lot in the rain, reading a letter from a lawyer I had never met, learning that my grandmother had spent her last weeks of clarity making sure I would know. I knew. I did something about it. And if you're in a similar place right now, wondering whether it's worth it, whether you have the standing, whether it will cost you more than it returns, I can't answer that for you. Every situation is its own, but I can tell you that on the other side of doing the hard thing, I found something I hadn't expected to find. Not just the money, not just the house. The knowledge that my grandmother had seen me, fully and clearly, and had trusted me to finish what she started. That is not something anyone can transfer to someone else. That is not something anyone can notarize away. Thank you for staying until the end. If this story made you feel something, anger, recognition, the particular exhaustion of having been dismissed by the people who were supposed to protect you, write it in the comments
I read every one. And if you want to hear what happened when a woman discovered her husband had been sending money to his family for years without telling her, that story is in the description below. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And if someone is telling you to be quiet about something that belongs to you, you have permission to keep talking. Like this